Welcome to the Celestial Saga channel. What makes a deadly world become a perfect vacation spot? Today you will learn the story of Marcus and Sophia, a couple who turned their dream into reality amidst incredible dangers. Marcus Reed and Sophia Bennett stood by the radar screen, their gaze entirely focused on IDOR 35's upper atmosphere. The humans were late. Marcus didn't bother with a translator. Years of training had enabled him to use the color-changing abilities of his dewlap to replicate the light patterns of the Udi language, the native tongue of Sophia's species. He caught her attention through his peripheral vision. She understood him, evident by the shifting colors radiating from the X-shaped crevices on her face. The chromatic node, the bioluminescent eye in the center of her node, locked onto him, and it took all his concentration to decode the meaning behind the specific color combination. If the humans don't show up, we should abandon the mission. Marcus's dewlap flickered with resolve as he conveyed, "We cannot quit, Sophia." His struggle with her complex language was clear. To secure the resort loan, we must decode the Murloc migration patterns. Whether the humans come or not, we'll do this. Sophia stared at him, silent. Her chromatic node darkened as she turned toward the window of their small research outpost. She stood there, her gaze fixed on the wild planet's surface for several long moments before turning back to him, her face changing colors rapidly. "We can't do this without outside assistance. This isn't a death world, but it's far from normal. Anything outside could be a danger to us. No amount of credits is worth our lives." Marcus was stunned by her response. This was their one-in-a-lifetime opportunity to leap from the bottom of society to the upper echelons of the Federation. Had there ever been a reward without risk? The only reason he refrained from snapping at her was because he wasn't skilled at expressing anger in her language. He forced himself to steady his emotions, preparing his dewlap for a passionate rebuttal. "How can you suggest giving up after all we've been through for this planet?" His dewlap pulsed with frustration. "Do you not remember our years of hardship? Have you forgotten how many times our careers were destroyed because of our relationship? Can you overlook my exile for loving you?" Marcus wasn't sure if his syntax and meaning were perfect, but they'd been together long enough for her to understand him despite his mistakes. "Don't you want to see the look on your family's faces when we become wealthier than any of them?" The edges of Sophia's chromatic node blazed white, her face so bright it almost seemed like it would explode. When she finally spoke, her bioluminescence reached levels Marcus considered dangerously intense. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't want to see that. Building the resort will make us wealthy. But what good will that wealth do if we end up inside a Murloc? We need help, Marcus. If the humans don't arrive, we'll have to hire other Deathworlders, not go outside alone." A chill ran through Marcus. Sophia wasn't fully aware of their dwindling finances, but the resonance barrier that kept the Murloc away from their station had already drained much of their remaining credits. And beyond that, the deal with the humans had required half of the payment up front, leaving them with barely enough to hire another team. Worse, Marcus had a nagging suspicion they'd been scammed. No other species would have agreed to come to IDOR 35 for the sum they had offered. And now, in hindsight, that deal seemed suspicious. If the humans didn't show, their remaining credits would only cover the cost of leaving the planet, and maybe the exorbitant shipping fees for their outpost, which they'd be lucky to sell for half of what they paid for it, assuming it wasn't damaged in transport. "If you're afraid of a Murloc, you can stay here while I go out and set the trackers on it myself." He wasn't ready to return to their former life. His days of struggling to keep a job because his partner was from another planet were behind him, and IDOR 35 was their ticket to a new life. While Sophia's emotions were flickering across her chromatic node, Marcus quickly grabbed his blaster and portable prismatic barrier, but as he reached for the Murloc trackers, a small light blinked on the radar screen. Sophia noticed it too, and before Marcus could caution her about the possibility of debt collectors showing up because of their loan to purchase the planet, her chromatic node lit up. "The humans are here." He almost mentioned the debt collectors, but the joy on her face made it harder to speak up. He and Sophia often argued, and their disagreements sometimes caused them to lose track of their words. But there was a reason they'd stayed together for so long, and still managed to afford a planet despite the harsh conditions. Without thinking, Marcus found himself standing next to Sophia, their hands instinctively seeking comfort from one another as they watched the radar blip fade away. Once the dot disappeared, they rushed to the door in unison. A press of a button revealed the familiar view of their research station, now unexpectedly hosting a spacecraft. Sophia's chromatic node was radiant, her words pouring out faster than Marcus could process. But he was still in shock when a group of humans, dressed in green and black, exited the spacecraft and made their way toward the research station. As they approached the resonance barrier, Marcus watched their expressions contort into grimaces, and when they got even closer, they all simultaneously raised their hands to the sides of their heads. The group of humans paused at the resonance barrier, their eyes locked onto it with a concentration that reminded Marcus of the Murlac, as if they were contemplating how to dismantle it. This was unexpected. The resonance barrier was designed solely to ward off the aggressive predators of Idor 35. Not any other life forms. Marcus exchanged a quick look with Sophia before deciding to approach the humans, despite the unusual situation. They dashed to the gate, reaching it in no time. As they stood before the humans, Marcus suddenly realized that he had forgotten his universal translator inside the research station. Just as he turned to head back for it, a small pebble hit him in the back. He whirled around and saw one of the humans holding a flat screen high, displaying a message in familiar script. "Turn off that thing, or we're walking out." No number of humans inside the station could shake the unease that crept into Marcus's thoughts. Sophia had already complied with their request to shut off the resonance barrier. But now Marcus felt exposed. Was this some kind of death world mentality, or just a matter of pride? The humans had promised to protect them, yet Marcus didn't feel any safer. Ethan King, the leader of the group, seemed incapable of focusing on any conversation. He frequently complained about certain equipment being bothersome, and Sophia would have to turn it off before they could continue speaking. The other 5 humans, however, gave off a strange vibe altogether. Marcus noticed that, while Ethan sat at the table with him and Sophia, the others kept moving their mouths. Almost constantly, he deduced that this was their way of communicating, through sequences of lip movements rather than color changes. What was odd, though, was that they never seemed to look at one another while their mouths moved. It made them appear like a group of individuals babbling away, with no one paying attention to anyone else's words. Their financial situation didn't give them the luxury of being choosy. But could these humans really protect them from the Murlac? To find out, Marcus decided to ask Ethan directly, his dewlap conveying his question. "What makes you so sure you can turn off the resonance barrier?" Sophia shot him a disapproving glance, but Marcus stood firm, locking eyes with Ethan and awaiting his response. Ethan's mouth began to move again, and his translator lit up with a message. "You might not get how, but we can detect any Murlac that comes close before we see them." Not understand how? Marcus felt slighted. Did the human think he was too primitive to understand their methods? His species might not come from a death world, but they'd survived countless dangers in the galaxy, long before humans even thought about space travel. He didn't need to know the exact science behind their methods. He only needed assurance that they weren't lying yet. That air of superiority still grated on him. "Maybe I don't," Marcus replied, his dewlap shifting colors rapidly. "But if you're so confident in your technology, you should have no trouble proving it works before we go outside." Sophia shot him another disapproving glance, and this time, she joined the conversation. "You were ready to go out there alone, and now you're worried? Why do you always have to be like this?" A wave of frustration surged through Marcus, but it quickly subsided when she added, in a faint glow only he could see, "They're death worlders. Be nice to them." Marcus recognized her concern and instantly regretted his tone. He scrambled to find the right words, but before he could speak, Ethan's translator lit up again. "There's nothing wrong with being cautious. If you'd like an explanation, one that might be a lot to take in, we'd be happy to explain how we can detect danger without actually seeing it." Marcus and Sophia exchanged a meaningful glance, both expecting a different response from a death worlder. The tension in the air began to ease as Marcus sensed some genuine concern in Ethan's words. He lowered his dewlap in a sign of respect, a gesture of humility in his culture. "I apologize for my tone earlier," he conveyed, his colors softening to a calming hue. "Your methods may be unconventional, but that doesn't mean they're without merit. Please explain how your technology works. We need every advantage if we're going to survive on this planet." As the couple watched intently, Ethan's mouth began to move again. "This is where it might get a little strange for you. Let me ask you a few questions first. Are you familiar with radio waves?" Marcus was confused. "Of course we are," he replied. But Ethan continued without missing a beat. What about gravitational waves? Marcus had no idea why Ethan was asking these questions. Maybe the human really does think I'm primitive, Marcus thought. But despite his growing irritation, he answered, "We knew of them long before your species discovered fire." His reply earned him a sharp glare from Sophia. Ethan, however, remained unfazed. His mouth moved again, and the translator continued. To measure gravitational waves, radio waves, and even sound waves, your species relies on all sorts of modern tech, right? Marcus's frustration was now palpable, but he kept his composure. Why are you asking us something so obvious? He thought his response, however, remained measured. Correct? We humans don't. Ethan, along with every other human in the room, flashed a set of teeth in unison. The translator then displayed another stream of text. At least not for sound waves. We have an organ that detects vibrations in the air. Two, actually. Ethan gestured toward the protrusions on their heads. Our brains even have a dedicated area for processing those vibrations. We call it the auditory cortex. Time seemed to freeze for Marcus. He was stunned, but Sophia responded differently. She stood, her chromatic nodes flashing rapidly as the resonance barrier flickered. Just like it does to the Murloc, she explained, the barrier is overwhelming your senses. Ethan stayed seated, his translator screen lighting up with a single word. Precisely. Marcus remained frozen, his mind swirling with questions. How could beings who perceive vibrations see the world? Did they use this ability for communication? If his understanding of physics was correct, it seemed they could communicate through walls or even in fog. Perhaps they could even pinpoint the source of the vibrations. But all of this depended on one thing. How sensitive is your organ? He asked, standing with urgency in his colors, signaling the importance of the question. For some unknown reason, however, Ethan touched his forehead and shook his head. As this happened, the other humans flashed their teeth again, their expressions somehow less serious than before. I apologize for my crew, Ethan said. They're a bit immature for this kind of discussion. Ethan's mouth moved again, and the screen showed more text. To answer your question, he continued, our sensitivity to sound waves is good enough to detect a heavy Murloc steps from quite a distance. Both of you would be fairly easy to notice from far away, given how much sound you unknowingly produce. When Ethan finished speaking, Marcus was impressed. He now felt much better about their decision to hire the humans. If their abilities were on par with the Murlocs, they could prove to be a more valuable asset than any cheap equipment. They might even help them solve the mystery of the Murlocs' migration patterns, cutting down the time they needed to research the planet before the bank would consider funding their project. If he had felt fear when the humans requested the resonance barrier be turned off, now all Marcus felt was curiosity about how well the human sound detection could function in the field. This could be their chance to unlock the Murloc's migratory patterns and prove once and for all that Idor 35 had worth. The planet was vast, full of peculiar structures. Rising from the ground, slender stalks towered over much of the rocky landscape. These towering stalks dwarfed Marcus, Sophia, and the humans. At the top of each stalk was a wide, circular canopy that curved delicately downward at the edges, as though shielding the fragile underside from the elements. Walking side by side with Sophia, Marcus gripped his blaster and portable prismatic barrier tightly. Sophia, on the other hand, carried only a laser gun, one the humans had deemed ineffective against the Murloc. Ethan led the group, accompanied by two others, all carrying heavy-looking guns that seemed to be made entirely of solid metal. Three more humans guarded their rear. Marcus had been told this formation was designed to ensure their safety. And when he asked if they would flee in the face of danger, Ethan had jokingly said that they wouldn't consider it until they had collected the rest of their payment. Even if it wasn't meant as a joke, the comment made Marcus feel slightly reassured. As they moved through the dark maze of stalks, Marcus began to notice the first practical advantage of sound detection. Unlike him and Sophia, the humans never took their eyes off the path. Their form of communication didn't require eye contact, allowing them to constantly scan their surroundings for potential threats. Marcus was still trying to figure out how their communication system worked when Sophia's chromatic node lit up, conveying her words to him. "Did you remember to bring the trackers, Marcus?" Her question struck a nerve. Of course I remembered the trackers. Ethan was carrying them, and he'd even promised that he had a secure method for attaching them to the Murloc. Her chromatic node flickered faintly. "So you trust them now?" Marcus was confused earlier. Sophia had urged him to be patient and nice, and now she was questioning him. Sometimes he just didn't understand her. "What's the problem, Sophia?" he asked, noticing that the humans weren't paying attention. "You know they're behaving well for Deathworlders. Why bring this up now?" Her chromatic node glowed with concern. "I've been thinking if something happens to us on this planet, we lose our claim and anyone else could bid for it." Her light dimmed as her eyes fixed on him. When the humans realized that the Murlocs' migration patterns are key to identifying valuable areas for development, they might see us as the only obstacle to claiming this planet for themselves. She had a point. Normally, Marcus would have been the one to catch such a detail, but now their future seemed entirely in the hands of the humans, and that was a gamble. He turned to her, his dewlap subtly shifting colors. "We're broke, my love. Our own species won't lift a finger to help us, and without the humans, this planet is as good as useless. We're putting everything on their good intentions and unusual abilities, okay?" Marcus patted Sophia's back. She didn't respond right away, but after a brief pause, she took his hand, signaling her agreement. They continued their journey until they reached the heart of Murloc territory. Here, Ethan suddenly stopped at the front, raising his hand in a signal they had agreed upon earlier. Marcus and the others instinctively lowered their weapons, but there was no immediate threat in sight. The humans, however, were already scanning the surroundings, their weapons directed toward the maze of slender stalks ahead. Ethan was the first to target something, and just as Marcus began to doubt the situation, a Murloc, about the height of Ethan's waist, emerged from the shadows. The creature, with 4 legs, charged at Ethan with remarkable speed, its limbs stretching and contracting fluidly. Despite its soft, jelly-like body, its long neck swung with each step, and the creature's eyeless face twisted into an open, hungry maw, seemingly ready to devour Ethan. Marcus had already imagined Ethan firing at the creature. But then he was reminded of what it meant to be a Deathworlder. Instead of shooting, Ethan stood his ground, waiting until the Murloc was nearly upon him, then delivered a single crushing punch that knocked the creature unconscious. With the Murloc on the ground, Ethan calmly aimed his gun at a vulnerable spot on the creature's rear. With precision, he lined up the shot and squeezed the trigger. The gun's muzzle flared to life. Marcus and Sophia exchanged a stunned glance at the unexpected violence, but their shock quickly subsided as the Murloc scrambled back to its feet and fled, the tiny hole in its back. The only evidence of its close call, Marcus began to understand what had just happened when he noticed a small light blinking on his wristband. It was a signal from the first tracker. Sophia noticed it too, and conveyed the thought that was still struggling to form in Marcus's mind. Ethan might have shot the tracker into the Murloc. Marcus found it hard to believe what he had just witnessed, but before he could process it fully, more Murlocs began to emerge from the shadows. The other humans tracked the creature's movements before they even appeared, and like Ethan, they held back from shooting. Instead, they engaged in the battle with fists and kicks. While Ethan made quick work of the first Murloc with his bare hands, his companions struggled more. Some resorted to using the butts of their guns to subdue the blind creatures, steadily increasing the number of Murlocs they took down. Meanwhile, Ethan remained calm, observing the chaos, intervening only to shoot tracking devices into the creatures or to lend a hand to his companions. When necessary, Marcus and Sophia were in awe, struggling to believe the raw efficiency they were witnessing. Marcus even lowered his blaster and prismatic barrier, finally understanding the stark difference between himself and a Deathworlder, beings born on a planet so fiercely competitive that relying on a single sense wasn't nearly enough to survive. The fight continued until Ethan ran out of trackers. At that point, he tossed a small metallic sphere, marked with yellow symbols, into the maze of stalks where the Murlocs had been emerging. Marcus saw a flash of light from that direction, and soon after, the remaining Murlocs fled. None daring to approach again, Ethan returned to them, adjusting his translator to face them. "Well, unless you've got more trackers to shoot, that's the end of our deal." Marcus and Sophia exchanged a meaningful look, and he conveyed his thoughts. "We appreciate your help and are impressed by your vibration detection organ." Sophia's chromatic node flashed with color. "If we'd known Deathworlders could handle the Murloc so easily, we would never have bothered with the resonance barrier." Ethan's mouth moved, and his translator displayed his reply. "How much did you pay for that thing?" The other humans gathered around, clearly curious about the conversation. Marcus and Sophia rarely discussed personal matters, especially with Deathworlders. But after seeing how easily one of their biggest problems had been solved, Marcus decided to share a little. We paid $30,000 for the barrier, plus another $20 for shipping. Ethan exchanged glances with the other humans before he opened up. When the guys and I heard someone had bought our favorite planet, we decided to come check it out one last time. But imagine our surprise when we found just two business partners running the whole operation from a tiny research outpost. At that moment, Marcus and Sophia couldn't have known that their next decision would alter the course of their lives forever. They couldn't have predicted that the sentence that had always made things harder for them would, for the first time, win them the sympathy of this group of humans and lead to a long-lasting friendship. This sentence came from Sophia, who shared a complex glance with Marcus before her chromatic node flashed a short burst of colors. We are actually a couple 12 local years later. Marcus stood behind the bar at their resort, its design inspired by many things he and Sophia had encountered on their travels to a certain blue death world. The glass walls beside him offered a panoramic view of their mountain resort on Edor 35, a breathtaking site the couple had carefully chosen for its perfect blend of security and practicality. As he did every evening at sunset, Marcus slowed his work to take in the view. Even after all these years, he remained entranced by the circular canopies, which, from their mountain vantage point, looked like a vibrant sea of colors. His dewlap relaxed as he reminisced about the countless hours spent planning their dream sanctuary. It had always been their vision to create a place where beings from all over the universe could come together in peace. A place where the exotic flora and fauna of Idor 35 could be admired without fear. And as he watched the sunset dip below the horizon, bathing the resort in a golden glow, he knew they had accomplished it. Yet, a sudden chill crept into Marcus's contentment when he saw Sophia emerging from the garden, accompanied by a quartet of Alier, an unmistakable reminder of her species, a reminder of how far they had come. The calm of his evening shattered, replaced by an unsettling sense of tension. As Sophia approached, her face was a mask of composure, but her eyes betrayed a silent plea for help. Marcus, having spent years learning the subtleties of her unspoken cues, instantly recognized the signs of distress. Behind her, the four individuals trailing along confirmed his suspicions. They were the kind of guests who could turn an otherwise peaceful evening into a nightmare. That much was unmistakable. At the forefront of the group was a towering female whose chromatic nodes were already shifting in a kaleidoscope of colors. Long before they reached the bar, she launched into her tirade. "Why have you brought us to an Uloth? We demand to speak to your manager. This is unacceptable. We need someone capable of solving problems, not a trip back to our rooms for translators." Marcus noticed Sophia's chromatic node flicker with the barely contained fury she was struggling to hide. He knew it wouldn't be long before she lost her composure. "He is my husband. He understands you far better than anyone with a translator." Sophia's voice was steady but laced with tension. The disgust that spread across their faces was all too familiar. A look Marcus and Sophia had encountered countless times over the years whenever they revealed their relationship. The towering female turned to him, and Marcus anticipated her reaction before her chromatic node even began to shift him. "Understanding us? As if an Uloth could grasp the intricacies of our language." Being extra cautious with his words, Marcus projected their language through his dewlap. "Pardon the inconvenience, dear customers. How may I assist you on this fine day?" He was met with surprised stares from the group, but what really caught his attention was the obvious disapproval from the tall female. She threw a sharp look at her companions, ensuring they masked their shock before turning back to him, feigning indifference. "Are you really the manager?" Marcus and Sophia owned both the resort and the planet, but very few customers knew that they employed many members of their species, and whenever one of them ended up face-to-face with a guest, it often led to these uncomfortable interactions. "Yes, I am the manager," Marcus replied smoothly, the words practically automatic by now. "What seems to be the issue?" The tall female's chromatic node sparked again, shifting with such speed it was almost impossible to track. "Your employee refuses to let us into the lower gardens. They say it's off limits to our species." Marcus had heard many complaints before, but this one was new. Most individuals were aware that much of Idor 35 was dangerous and preferred to avoid the more hazardous areas. "I'm sorry, but the lower gardens and the surrounding forest are restricted. The Murlocs are aggressive, and the gardens lie too close to their migration path." Her chromatic node flared once more. We saw a group of humans enter the gardens, and your employees let them do whatever they wanted. Why are they allowed in while we aren't? Marcus could sense that this was one argument he might not win, especially when even the males in the group were staring at him, waiting for an explanation. But he didn't panic. Calmly, he conveyed his thoughts. I understand your confusion. What you might not know is that the humans are death worlders with both strong bodies and 2 additional senses. One of these senses allows them to detect vibrations in the air, so they are never caught off guard by an attack. That's why we allow them in the lower gardens. The lower gardens existed specifically because humans preferred a peaceful, quiet environment during their vacations. But before Marcus could elaborate further, the female interrupted. That's ridiculous, she snapped. We saw no murlocs in the gardens, and the humans even let their children run around without supervision. This is unfair. But then again, what else would we expect from someone who despises their own species? Her words were laced with personal venom, and the whole group turned their gaze on Sophia. Marcus could feel the sting of the insult, and he exchanged a quiet but knowing look with his wife. In that moment, it became clear that they could no longer afford to play nice. The rules were in place for a reason, but if they wanted to test them, Marcus was prepared. The rules exist for your safety, he began coolly. But if you want to see for yourselves why the human children are allowed in the gardens, we can show you a video from the last time the murlocs attempted an attack. Gone were the days when Marcus and Sophia had to swallow their pride and endure the hostility of their own species. They could now afford to lose a customer, or 1,000. The tall female tried to keep arguing, but Marcus did something incredibly rude. He turned his back to her mid-sentence and walked toward a large screen, deliberately ignoring her as he searched for the security footage. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw them muttering about complaining to the owner, but Marcus hit play on the footage without a second thought. The screen flickered to life, showing a calm garden scene, children running around while their parents chatted by nearby tables. Suddenly, a group of murlocs appeared from the edges of the garden, heading straight for a little girl, playing by the lake. The adults scrambled toward her, but the distance was too great, and it was clear the murlocs would reach her first. At that moment, a large dog, noticing the danger, rushed toward the murlocs with incredible speed. Marcus glanced at the group of Alir, noticing they had stopped their complaints and were now transfixed by the footage. When he turned his attention back to the screen, he saw the most brutal display of violence he had ever witnessed. The dog was viciously attacking the murlocs, biting at their necks as they fell one after another. Every time a murloc lunged, the dog would evade or overpower it, leaving more bodies behind. By the end of the footage, the group of murlocs had been reduced by half, and the rest were retreating. The dog, unharmed and wagging its tail, stood triumphantly as the murlocs fled. Marcus could see the surprise etched on the faces of the Alir as they stared at the screen. He reached out and held Sophia's hand, waiting for their attention to shift back to him. If you still wish to go into the lower gardens, we can allow it, if you sign a waiver of liability. His dewlap flashed with a final thought. But let me share a little business secret with you. There are no resonance barriers in that area, and the dogs are the only things keeping the murlocs at bay.